Hello, everyone. Randy Hawthorne here from Nonprofit Hub, your executive editor today, and I am so excited to have two presenters. You get two for the price of one today. How huge is that? Noah and Emily we've been chatting a little bit before this, and they're having snow. Yeah, that's fun. September snow. Good to have you two today.
Thank you. Great to be here, Randy.
Hey, before we get started, I just wanted everyone to know that we will be recording this. Crazy, who knew someone's recording a webinar? And so we will get that out to you afterwards, because I'm sure this will be a hydrant of love, a fire hydrant of love with a lot of information that you're going to want to share with others as well. So with that, I'm going to remove myself from the screen so that you two can take it away.
Well, thank you, Randy. We're planning to use the chat a lot, and we know there's a question feature, but we wanted to see if people can find the chat. If you can find the chat, go ahead and send a message to the whole audience, just saying hello and where are you in the world. Let's see if that comes through. If not, we'll switch to the questions.
They're all putting them in the question box right now.
Ah, do you see a chat? No? All right, so we're seeing them in the questions. Very great. All right, there it goes. Virginia from Rachel. Perfect. All right, sounds like there's no chat and we'll be doing questions. That's what we'll do today. Well, welcome to our webinar on trauma-informed management. Our goal today is to teach you about trauma and its impacts, and we want you to leave with some tangible ideas on what you can do as a manager to be a great boss with this in mind. So let me introduce myself. My first exposure to trauma in a professional setting was actually when I was an elementary school teacher. My school was in Central Harlem, and it was some of the hardest work I have ever done. And I think it was maybe the fourth day that I found a therapist to get started, because it was really difficult for me. And a lot of the students I worked with had their own trauma that they were bringing to the classroom. And I didn't really get any training on how to deal with that fact. Fast forward about 20 years, and now I run a nonprofit in the education space, Empowering Education. We provide elementary and middle schools a social and emotional learning program. And I've learned a lot about trauma because we train teachers in how to teach in a way that's sensitive to all the trauma that's in a classroom. And through this process, I've learned that there's lots of trauma going on. And it's as if I walk around and I sort of see these like little invisible T's over all these people and realize it's everywhere. Now, Emily will introduce herself. This is sort of the world she is in, and it's very obvious to her, but it's sort of been a new realization to me. I do executive coaching and on the side, and I practice something called Radical Candor. It's a great book if you've never read it. Really predicated on the idea that a great boss is one that cares about the people that they manage. And I see this as part of being a caring manager, is understanding what trauma is and how it's playing out in the workplace. So that's why I'm really interested and excited about this topic. What about you, Emily?
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily. I wonder if you'll just quickly say you can hear me well. Can you just type that into the question box? Let me know if you can hear my voice okay. Great, thank you. Thanks for the big yes. So I am a psychotherapist and the clinical and training director at the Postpartum Wellness Center of Boulder. We're a team of therapists and other wellness providers who support people in their transition to parenthood. And we work a lot with folks who are struggling with mood and anxiety issues. And underneath all of those mood and anxiety issues, oftentimes we find that folks have the experience of trauma. And so as Noah indicated, I am really steeped in this topic of trauma. So I am the daughter of two psychotherapists, And I can remember as early as the age of 5, sitting at the dinner table and having my folks talk about their work in totally appropriate, ethical ways, of course. But they'd be sharing a lot about the themes that they were seeing and what was going on for the people who were coming to their office. And very often, whatever somebody was struggling with related to trauma in some way or other. So at this really early age, I had kind of normalized for me the idea that we go through hard things. Many of us go through really hard things and have a hard time going through and dealing with those hard things. So as I went through my training in this particular profession and my experience professionally, I really came to see and understand how incredibly prevalent trauma is. And I learned a lot about how it impacts people, how it shows up for them personally and professionally. And then also I've learned a lot about how to treat trauma. So it's a particular kind of passion of mine. It's hard. It's hard to talk about. It's not something that's comfortable or sort of the norm, but I feel really passionate about getting the information out there. So I'm so glad that all of you are here today.
So talking about you, we're interested in knowing what brought you here. There's lots of ways you could have spent this hour. So why did you choose to come to this? Why is trauma and management and the intersection interesting to you? And Emily, by the way, you can pull out that question module and see everyone's answer. So go ahead and type it in. We'd love to get a sense of what brought you here today. Seeing someone talk about COVID being very traumatic. Yes, I agree, Sarah. Emily is still similar to me, realizing trauma is so prevalent. Great, Rachel. Love that renewed focus.
Yeah, I see somebody talking about secondary trauma. We'll talk about that later.
Racial inequity. Yes, Sarah, that's a great point. Something we'll be talking about. Well, it sounds like you're all very thoughtful people, and I'm so glad to have this hour with you. Here's what we're going to be doing. We'll talk, as I mentioned, is our goal, talk about trauma, its impacts. Some of this, if you've read up on it, you may know this, so hopefully it'll be a useful refresher. What are triggers? Now, these are words we use a lot, but what does it really mean? What's a trigger in the workplace? Then we'll get into some do's and maybe things we're not responsible for. We'll look at some scenarios, see how to push us to see how trauma could be playing out in unexpected ways, and then we'll do some Q&A and push you to think about your takeaways. This is a session on trauma, and while Emily and I are positive people and excited about this, it's also a heavy topic. And as you'll see in the stats that Emily will share with you later, a lot of people have experienced trauma, some of it with big capital T, some of it with small t. And so this session might remind you of trauma you've experienced. And if that happens, know that that's not unusual. I've practiced this session and had people crying just hearing some statistics. So don't be surprised if that happens. Take care of yourself. If you have to leave, we understand. And you are not alone. Okay? We're going to be asking you to chat a lot, so keep your keyboard nearby. And oh, there goes your phone dinging. Do you know, how long do you think it takes for your attention to come back after your phone dings? Go ahead and type that into the question box. How many minutes do you think? Someone did a study on this. Okay, see a lot of 1s and 3s. See Jane going big with 20, Rebecca too. It's 23 minutes apparently. 23 minutes to fully come back after your phone dings. And when I heard that, I thought a lot about the way I set up my workspace and thinking maybe I should put it on silent more often. And I invite you to put your phone on silent right now to stay with us. I think you'll get a lot out of it. One way to do this is to make a mind map as you listen, and as you do this for meetings, whatever, is just draw what you're hearing and make circles and connections and things like that. So hope you'll be able to stick with us. Let's dive in and start learning about trauma.
Yeah. So we have some slides, yeah? I don't think they're up right now.
Oh, I realize. Am I not sharing slides? Let me do that. That would be helpful for this whole thing.
It'd be helpful for everybody.
Let me. Give me 1 second. Excuse me.
All right.
All right.
So let's dive on in. Let's dive in here. So before we can even have this conversation, we want to define what we're talking about when we talk about trauma. So we're going to pull up a definition for you, and I'd like you to just take a few moments and read this through to yourself, just a few. So I hope everybody had time to read. I know this definition well. So there's a couple of points that I want to highlight around this definition. And the first is that trauma is the experience of an event, not an event itself. And so two people could go through the exact same circumstances and experience those circumstances really differently. So let's take a car accident is a good example. Two people could go through the same kind of troubling car accident. One person can walk away from that and be kind of shaken and feel a little off, maybe just a little nervous that day, but ultimately after a few days, maybe even a few hours, kind of regulate and feel much better. And then a second person could go through that exact same situation, that same car accident, and afterwards, instead of kind of grounding and feeling better, that person might notice that they are feeling really startled really easily. They might be scared to get behind the wheel again. They might have flashbacks or nightmares. So again, trauma is the experience of the event itself, something that might be scary and dangerous, but ultimately sort of sticks in the system for one person instead of another. And there's three main components of trauma that we're going to reference over and over again today that are really important to keep in mind. So the first is that lack of a sense of safety. The second is powerlessness, that feeling of helplessness, not being able to control something. And the third is a disregard, basically a disregard for well-being. And we're going to come back to those because they show up over and over again when we talk about trauma.
So when trauma occurs, it affects our brain. So let's do a quick brain lesson here. And this is your brain. We all have one. And it's much more complex than this picture would suggest, but it's useful to think of it as these three big systems. And the reptilian brain is sort of early evolutionary form of our brain. Thank the reptilian brain when you quickly jump out of the way of a bus. It seems like Emily and I are big on car accidents. So that's what's helping you out. The limbic brain is that feeling brain, and then the thing that makes us so powerful and interesting and dangerous and fun, neocortex. I think the emotions and feelings are fun too. The neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, that's where all the fancy thinking happens. Now, in most situations, all these systems are at play when you're experiencing things. Maybe not as much the reptilian brain, but we could debate that later. When trauma happens, you are pulled into the limbic and reptilian brain. And that those systems are overwhelmed. If they weren't overwhelmed, it wouldn't be trauma. So what we say with children, and I think it's a useful thing for all of us, is the front here is the wizard brain, and the back, the deep part, is the lizard brain. So you get pulled out of the wizard brain into the lizard brain.
So I love that brain stuff. I find it so fascinating. I could like nerd on this for hours and hours. But really what's important for us is to talk about the implications, right, of what's happening for the brain when it's experiencing trauma. And the implications are significant for anybody, anywhere throughout the lifespan. But we're actually going to start this conversation by talking about childhood trauma. We're talking about childhood trauma, even though presumably all of you work with adults and manage adults, because of what we know in terms of the vulnerability related to trauma and childhood. So it's really important to kind of reference back to that brain concept and the way in which brains get overloaded during trauma. And that is part of why, for children who experience trauma, it is such an intense and vulnerable thing, because children are, as we know, and have learned really sort of in the more recent 10 to 20 years, there's so much brain development that's happening for children, especially early childhood, young children. And so when their brains get overloaded in the ways that trauma overloads them, it affects their brain development. There are certain systems that sort of get frozen and others that become hyperactive. And it ultimately, over the long term, affects how their brain's development, which then also, of course, affects the rest of their development. The other reason why trauma is really important to talk about and think about in childhood, it's just because of the vulnerable time that is for a person, right? Because children do not have the power to affect change in their circumstances very easily, right? They're at the mercy of their caregivers, of their environments. And so children are really vulnerable to the impact of trauma because they oftentimes cannot keep themselves physically or emotionally safe, and they're not able to change circumstances to stop trauma from happening. They're pretty helpless. And so what we know about trauma is that when it's not treated in childhood and beyond, it really impacts a person's overall lifespan. It affects them and sort of follows them throughout their life and impacts then how they are functioning as adults. So I want to go back to that car accident. I know, it's just an easy one. It's an easy thing to think about when we're talking about trauma because it feels so obvious. When you think about those two people, the adult who kind of walked away from that car accident relatively unscathed, we can guess that it's pretty likely they did not have an experience of trauma in their childhood or earlier in their history, because trauma really builds upon itself. So a traumatic experience, a trauma that happens, oftentimes what happens is then we're referring back and sort of remembering, whether it's our brains consciously or unconsciously, remembering earlier traumas. So the person who walks away from that car accident feeling relatively unscathed probably hasn't had experiences that are really scary and dangerous that are getting kind of called upon. But then if we think about the person who walked away from that car accident who got really stuck in it, it's possible, maybe even likely actually, that they have a history of trauma. And so adults with a childhood history of trauma, they're going to recover much differently, with much more difficulty, from a traumatic event that happens later in life. And even if they're not encountering a traumatic event, those adults, if they haven't processed through and kind of healed those earlier traumas, it does impact their functioning in all sorts of ways that we're going to talk about today.
So Emily's talking about the importance of childhood trauma in the scope of traumas that happen. And there's actually a big study done in the 90s around the relationship between health outcomes and trauma that people experience as children. So health of adults and related to their what's called adverse childhood experiences. And this is a term in education used a lot, ACEs, and sort of diagnose, counting up how many ACEs, kind of gives you a sense of where that child may be. There are 10 of these, and I would like you on your paper, you don't have to chat these, but what do you think the 10 are? See if you can jot them down. I'll be silent for 20 seconds. See if you can come up with 10 things that you think would count as likely traumatic experiences for children. Go ahead, jot them on your paper. Okay, so give me some time, and I'm going to show you the 10, and we'll sort of see what you already thought of here. They fall into 3 categories: abuse, environmental challenges, and neglect. So abuse, probably things that came to mind for a lot of people, and I don't think these need much definition. Environmental challenges used to be called household challenges. It's been expanded, environmental or community, because, for example, systemic racism could also fit into this category here and can be a traumatic experience. And then neglect, emotional or physical neglect. And by the way, Emily was telling me that bullying is often considered now one of the ACEs, but no one wants to have 11 on a list. You have to stick with 10, keep it clean. So these three groups here relate to the three themes that Emily brought up earlier. So abuse, that leads to that lack of safety. Those environmental challenges tend to engender a sense of powerlessness, and that neglect leads to that sense of disregard.
So I am really curious to hear from folks, actually, what, if any of these ACEs on this list, if there's something that did not make it onto your list. So if you'll just write in the question box, just one thing maybe that you didn't think of, whatever, something you might be surprised by, but what did not make it onto your list that you wrote down? You can take a minute to just answer here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, death of a parent. It should fall on the list. It's really, this list is short, right? There are so many more challenges that children experience that are really specific. Yeah, it's really interesting to see through what struck folks. So one thing I want to say is that there are lots of reasons why something that is on this list might not have ended up on your list. And one is that it might just be that in your own history, like you don't have a sense of these things. They're not part of your upbringing. They're not part of your sort of they haven't directly impacted you or people you're close to. But sometimes we don't think of these kinds of adverse experiences because they did happen to us, or they did happen to someone we're close to. And it's uncomfortable to think about that. So we sort of push it away. And another reason might be that if somebody grew up with any of these as their circumstances, it might be that it's kind of normalized. It doesn't feel necessarily like a trauma. I work with a lot of clients who have to sort of learn to think about the fact that what they've experienced is actually trauma. It was just sort of what they went through. It was sort of normal. So it's just interesting to think about that as we learn through and sort of work through some of these things, what what feels new and different, and what maybe you just sort of have pushed away or not thought of. So as we've been kind of referencing, trauma is really, really prevalent. And that study that Noah talked about, where we came up with this term of adverse childhood experiences, actually found it was much more prevalent than the researchers believed it would be. And it really turned out that it knew no bounds. It really touched people everywhere. So we wanted to pull up some of these statistics today and just share them with you. And even though, as I mentioned, I feel pretty steeped in this topic and I work and deal with it a lot, I still find it profound to just quietly look at these numbers. I think it's impactful and it's important. So we're going to go through these, and I'm going to be quiet for a minute and just let you really settle in with the statistics that are in front of us. I'm just noticing that I have to breathe while I read these. And so I just want to suggest that you all do that, actually. Do that right now, wherever you are. Just make sure you take a big breath when you read these, because it's really profound to think about how many people are impacted by trauma. And it might touch upon our own circumstances, our own histories. So I think these stats really speak for themselves. But the thing that I want to point out is that last bullet there, that many people have experienced emotional abuse or neglect. And this one is pretty insidious because it's subtle and it's quiet. It's really underreported and under-researched, and still so significant and impactful. This is heavy. So let's talk a little bit more. We're gonna stay with the heaviness, and then we'll transition out of it as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the impact of what we just saw. So the impact of trauma really on people. Clearly, I think the obvious thing that we all know is that trauma has significant emotional impact on somebody's well-being. So an adult who has a history of trauma is going to have a nervous system that's really on high alert. And those folks end up sort of presenting as something that we call in our field hypervigilant, which means that they're kind of like this, right? There's this sense of prevailing danger that they are constantly looking for. And there's a hypersensitivity. So there tends to be a reading of cues in a really intense way. So people who are impacted by trauma, whose sort of brains live in that trauma state, are oftentimes on high alert. They're expecting danger and even perceiving danger when it's not actually there. And this can really impact their capacity to have close and connected relationships. It can affect them in sort of professional efficacy. It's really challenging to be in that state of high alert when it's actually not necessary. And so it impacts people in all sorts of emotional and cognitive ways that I think we can all sort of, they're logical, it makes sense. I think it's also important to note from that ACEs study that they found that there's actually a high correlation between the ACEs. So the more ACEs you have, the higher likelihood it is that you have some sort of, there's a correlation between the leading causes of death and those ACEs. So things like heart disease, diabetes, risk of stroke. And I know that sometimes people are surprised when we talk about the mind and the body in this connected way. But when you think about it, your brain is inside your body, right? It's a part of the body. And what's happening to the traumatized brain impacts you constantly on a physiological level. So it makes total sense that untreated and certainly chronic trauma is going to impact people physically, not just mentally and emotionally. So all of that said, it feels really important to name that trauma is treatable. And I have particularly seen, witnessed, and participated in trauma treatment for people who are as young as babies all the way through older adults. And the more we learn about how the brain works and how the traumatized brain works, the more efficient and helpful our treatments are. And there's lots of different ways that trauma can be treated. So it's not something that we need to sort of get stuck in a really negative and doom and gloom place. There's treatments that are heavily researched that work. And it's really, I think it's a really powerful statement to say, infancy all the way through older adults can be treated for trauma. And of course, like anything else, any other health risk that's out there, detecting trauma early and treating it as soon as possible is really helpful, because we want to be able to get that nervous system resting and get that person sort of out of that hypervigilant, high alert state as soon as possible. You are muted.
I realize I'm muted. Thank you. Regardless of whether the trauma has been treated or not, it's important to understand that there are triggers. And this is a word that I think we use a lot, you know, oh, he's a trigger for me, or that's a trigger for me. Let's talk about it in terms of trauma specifically. So back to that car accident, I'm never going to drive with you, Emily. It could be that what triggers, brings you back into that experience is another car accident. That's sort of the obvious trigger for one. And content is a part of it, like the same content. But that could be much more subtle than another car accident. It could be the sound. It could be the smell. Smell is incredibly powerful at bringing you back into memories. So it also could be the feelings that you had during that car accident. That feeling of time slowing down, or the way you had to just check everything out so quickly and so nervously. That, even though it could be a completely different content or context, that feeling could bring you back. And what happens is we get returned to the experience. We might remember that experience, or we might re-experience the feelings. And back to the brain, that takes us from what to what? From the wizard brain to the lizard brain. So if someone's triggered, if you're triggered, if I'm triggered, this is not a great time to write the quarterly report, because we're not able to use the part of our brain that does the fancy thinking. Now, when I do trainings with teachers, because children, can be kind of a bit more dramatic than adults, and that's arguable, I'll agree, but I think it's interesting to look at what are the workplace triggers. And we've got these 3 themes. So I encourage you, and you can do it on your paper, or I'm enjoying seeing people, what they write in the question box. What do you think are some workplace triggers around these 3 themes? So I'll give you a moment to jot it down on your paper or put it into the question area. What do you see as workplace triggers in these themes? I'm seeing a lot of good ideas. Power issues. Raised voices. Yeah. And Randy, if you're still there, if you can clear out what people wrote after we asked people to write in, that'd be helpful. So it's useful to think, let me add to some of the great thoughts you all have put in there. It's useful to think about 3 categories for this. Physical safety, which would include issues around sexual intimidation, emotional safety, or a lack of emotional safety, could be around being demeaned, ridicule, that kind of thing. And then I remember a few of you had talked about trauma in relating to inequity and issues around racism. Identity is a big issue around lack of safety. Is it safe for me to be who I am? And I don't think I know we don't have to think hard to think of identities that are not safe in so many workplaces. The powerlessness, what could trigger that is a sense of personal powerlessness. You've asked me to do something, but I don't know how to do it. I don't have the skills. I don't have the resources. I don't have the time. And I'm sure that many of you can relate to not feeling the time. Now, for many of us, that's just sort of a stressor. For someone who's trauma impacted, that could tap into a lot of deeper things in their history and brain. Environmental powerlessness. I'm at the whim of these huge forces. I know in my organization, we work with schools, we support them in helping children with social emotional learning. And my organization's work is really impacted by this pandemic. I'm sure many of your work, the work that you all do is as well. And then identity powerlessness. I know that I deserve that promotion, but because of who I am, that's what I'm sensing, I did not get it. Because of my identity, my gender, or whatever it is. Disregard, professional and personal. So the professional could look like, I've given my opinion, but it doesn't seem to do anything. It doesn't seem to be heard whatsoever. And then personal disregard. I'm sure we've all, or I hope you haven't, but probably many of you have had a boss who didn't really care when you were sick. or that didn't seem to matter at all, your own personal issues. So that also could be a trigger that pulls a person who's trauma impacted back into some of those feelings and memories, pulls them out of their wizard brain and makes them a lot less effective at work.
So I have a pretty intense background with nonprofits, and I'm going to talk about some of the triggers that can happen in nonprofit environments specifically, and I'm speaking about these lovingly because I have done nonprofit management and startup, and I know these environments well. And so when I say the things I'm sharing here, I say it with love. But nonprofits do have their own sort of special sauce in terms of how they relate to some of the triggers that Noah just shared. And the first thing I think you'll all be able to relate to this, many of you, is this scarcity mentality. And that has to do with funding, right? And oftentimes funders just underestimate the actual costs that are required to run a nonprofit. And so we are so often, when we're engaged in a nonprofit, we're trying to do so much with so little. And what that means is that a nonprofit often has to go without, right? There's like going without particular technological advances that would make the work more efficient. It might be skill training that's not learned. Sometimes staffs or teams are really stretched thin. And so there's this sort of way in which we're expected to do a lot with very little because of that scarcity mentality related to how funding often works and really can be very funder driven with expectations around keeping budgets with very low overhead and things like that. The next kind of quality of a nonprofit that lends itself sometimes to these triggers is the service mentality. So many of us come to nonprofit work because we're passionate about an issue, and that passion drives us and leads us to feel really committed and excited and invigorated. But it can also, sort of on the flip side, be very draining. There are times, again, sort of returning back to that scarcity mentality, when the expectations, the sort of cultural expectations that are at a nonprofit might be that you work beyond your own personal boundaries, that you work more than you are hoping to, that you give of yourself in certain ways, that you attend that extra event or fundraiser, that you really give and give and give. And oftentimes it can be subtle, but there can be messages at nonprofits sort of built from the foundation of the culture up, that we give without necessarily expectation of return, and sometimes can really be draining. So burnout is something that a lot of nonprofits talk about, no matter what their service is, kind of what they offer or provide. And then, as some of you indicated when we were talking about what interests us in this topic to begin with, so many nonprofits are there because they have this mission, right, to serve and to right some sort of serious ill in society and culture. And what that means is that we are oftentimes, as employees, exposed to really, really challenging material. And so working for a nonprofit, no matter what your role is really, but clearly if you're in a direct service role, can be very triggering and can sort of, certainly if you have a trauma background of your own, can touch upon that. But even if you don't, you're being exposed to things over and over again. So I know that early on in my career, I worked with babies and very young children who'd experienced trauma, so abuse or neglect. I was going into homes, working with babies and their parents and caregivers, and I saw a lot of things. And being early in my career, I didn't have a lot of my own professional resiliency. And it was really hard. I often found that I was taking things home. Sometimes topics made their way into my dreams, or I would just notice that after certain kinds of experiences, I would be tense or sad for a long time. And without really strong, meaningful supervision, it was easy for me to hold on to things. And so secondary trauma is something we talk about a lot in the nonprofit world and certainly in the clinical world. So all of that said, it is really important to keep trauma in mind as managers and employees in nonprofit settings. And we're going to talk more about how to do that. But before we get there, we want to make it clear that there are a lot of things that are not your job, right? Not part of your job description related to trauma. And the first thing to notice, we can't possibly avoid all triggers. That's the thing about triggers. We just can't know our employees, what they've been through, what might bother them, what might be a sticking point and what might not. We can't avoid them all. And nobody is asking or expecting us to do that. It's not your job as a manager to identify where you think trauma might be on your team, with your staff. Certainly, it's not your job to try and treat, right? There are professionals out there to do that. It's not your job to get really deeply connected or intimately involved in someone's personal life. So we're not asking for folks to be thinking about expanding their roles in that way. And it's also important to note that discomfort is not the same as a lack of safety. So we know that in order to grow in any setting, it's often really important to experience personal discomfort. The key is to be able to do that in a way that is hopefully as safe as possible, but you can't possibly, and we wouldn't want you to, avoid discomfort in your professional settings.
Let's go over to the things that we can do that are things we should hold ourselves to. So one, I think you're starting or continuing by coming here is building your awareness about trauma and knowing that this is happening at work. I think some people think, oh, it's work. There's no feelings at work. Of course, there's feelings at work, and of course, trauma is affecting work. And as I've learned about this, I've started to reflect on various moments that I've had as a manager, which I saw as sort of just like quirks of the moment. One comes to mind for me is I had this videographer who's great, and I would send him an email, hey, are you free in a couple hours to talk? And he'd say, what's going on? You know, and like there was no voice in the email, but I could sense the voice and what's going on. And then he said, I really would like you not to say, can we just talk? Please tell me what we're going to talk about. And, you know, I'm not going to Emily's point, it's not our job to identify, but I now am thinking that really disrupted him because it came up a few times. And so I started to develop my awareness that these kind of things could be related to trauma. And interestingly for me, I don't like that either when my family does that. You know, if my mother calls and says, you know, can you call me back? I'm immediately worried. I don't know if any of you have the same, like, well, no, what happened? But when I got to work, I forgot all of that, my own personal interest in being communicated with clearly. Validation is something that we should do when feelings are expressed. And by the sort of reasons you all came, I see that there's a lot of people in the mental health field are related. So you should no doubt know about this. When I talk with teachers, often talk about how simple validation can be if you're really committed to it. And it's when someone expresses their feelings, you pretty much say them back and reassure them that that feeling makes sense. I can see you're frustrated. That makes a lot of sense. None of us get to play soccer today because of COVID. That's really frustrating. And it's amazing how much that does for people, and is what they often want, to know that their feelings make sense. Then I've got a few other ideas about what our job is that all kind of fit into building a safe and supportive culture. Routine, people, particularly, I think all people, but particularly people who've experienced trauma or impacted by trauma, they want to be able to relax into the routines of the work day, the work week. So one thing I do is I try to have a very routinized meeting format so that people know what to expect. It also makes meetings a lot more productive. The week has certain cadences, and the feedback comes at certain cadences, so people know what to expect. And I see someone talking about how much they also hate their boss asking to talk. Yeah, I think a lot of us can relate to that. Clarity, what do I expect from you? And you know, so many of these things, I'm sure you're thinking, well, this is just good management. Yes, but it also really helps people who are impacted by trauma, who maybe, you know, they're hyper vigilant, They, especially as a child, were watching the caregiver, looking for signs of that things were going in the wrong direction. And what could be so nerve-wracking is not knowing what's coming. So the routine helps with that, the clarity. Hey, Sarah, can you put together a presentation for next week? Does that mean put together an outline? Does that mean put together slides? Does that mean be ready to present? Be very clear about what's expected, what success is not, so that they know. And someone's talking about sometimes we're in work that is not routine. You know, I'm sure many of you in nonprofits have things that just keep changing. What are the kinds of routines you can build around the lack of routine? Can there be some routines in the workplace? Every Monday we're going to have this. When we're going to debrief after things happen, after a chaotic experience, or we have to scramble, we're going to have this experience together. We know this is going to come. So hopefully that's helpful to you who wrote that in. Taking responsibility. If you experienced childhood trauma, often it's around someone not taking responsibility for problems and blaming it on the child. So as a manager, we should be very clear, in my opinion, to say, that was my mistake. That's me, that's on me. And that's to be really reassuring to people. Someone's talking about all our routines went out with the COVID window, went out the COVID window. I would like a COVID window, get some fresh air. We'll talk a little bit more about what to do with COVID, so thank you for that. And then I sort of added just sort of a general bucket of things that I think would be generally obvious to people, but concern for your employees, for your colleagues about, oh, you're sick. I know I will forget to check in with people who are sick, and I think I'm a caring person, but I also have lots going on, and I'm sort of a to-do list kind of guy. And so I'll put in my calendar, check in on that person, because it really, I know it's gonna make them feel good. Safety is obviously very important around the physical safety and making sure your workplace has very explicit ideas and standards about how we treat each other. And then responsiveness to people, somewhat similar to validation, responsiveness to when people are upset, also just like responsiveness to people's emails and like I'm listening to you, that kind of thing. So hopefully you've gotten a few ideas. I'm sure that many of these are things you are already doing. So I hope you're kind of going, oh, good, like I'm already managing in a way that's helpful to people impacted by trauma. What I like to do now is go through a scenario and challenge you to think about what are the triggers that could come up in this scenario and what we could do to mitigate the issues. And Emily, I'm starting to sort of delete people's questions after we read them. It helps us be able to see all of this. All right, here we go. Scenario. Oh, thank you for this slide. I forgot, make sure we know our own triggers and model self-care. Excuse me to jump back, but this is important. Even if you haven't been impacted by trauma, you have triggers that make you upset, making yourself aware of it, taking the time you need, and showing your employees that you're doing that can be helpful. Okay, back to scenarios. Here we go. Feedback. Why could receiving feedback be a trigger for trauma-impacted employees? And remind you here of those 3 themes. So go ahead and chat into the question box your thoughts about this. Go ahead. And I see people sort of referencing some of the themes. I agree, they all could be at play. I'm interested in pushing you, how does powerlessness get triggered in feedback? So see if you can go a little bit deeper than just naming one of them, but I agree with all of them so far. Great, thoughtful answers. Keep them coming, and we'll read a couple out. Right, I see so many thoughtful answers. So I'll say a few, and then Emily, if you see one that you want to highlight, go right ahead. Someone's referring to an abusive parent may have been hypercritical, and so there's sort of this history of hypercriticism and maybe attached to some, abuse or just hypercriticism in itself. And now I'm back in that, right? And a few other people reference that too.
Yeah, these are great. Just thinking about, somebody wrote here about an authority figure and being told what you're doing without a conversation, that sense of disregard, treated thoughtlessly, and the ways that that can trigger someone's earlier experiences of trauma.
I like the comment someone put about being powerless, feeling powerless to change the thing you're getting feedback on, either because you actually don't have that ability or resources, or just because you feel that way.
Yeah. And even so, somebody wrote here questioning knowledge or credibility, and how for somebody without a trauma background, that's not pleasant for anyone, but with a trauma background, right, that question of someone's knowledge or credibility can feel unsafe. Yeah, emotional and mental abuse. So feedback can really trigger them.
So great thoughts here, and on a not positive topic, but I really see you're seeing the way this can connect to the childhood traumas or earlier traumas of our lives. While we and some people are asking why we can't see, I'm afraid that this format only we can see, talking about powerlessness. So we're sorry, only we get to see what you write, but we promise it's very thoughtful, and there will be a recording a few people have asked that'll be available. We'll send it out about an hour after this ends. So we're kind of work on clearing this out while you think about what could you do to mitigate those issues, to reduce the triggers that are likely with receiving feedback. So go ahead and add that into the question box. Great. See people talking about sort of giving employees a heads up what's coming. Similar one, I see ask for written feedback prior to a sit down so that they have time to process it. And a simple version is, hey, I don't think that that project went so well. Let's talk about it and see what we can learn. So set the tone in that email maybe. Oh, I see a great one there. Ask the person how they want to receive feedback. A great way to address that lack of power, that feeling. Give them the choice. With children and with teachers, we constantly tell them, give children choice, because children who had trauma often had no choice.
And it's useful to do that, right, when you begin your working relationship, not when it's time to give the feedback, but to set the tone that you are empowering your employees and asking, how do you want me to manage you? How do you want me to be relating to you? I really appreciated that somebody pointed out here, reassuring that feedback is not reflective of personal worth. So separating out personhood from behavior, I think, is a really useful thing to do, however you might do that in managing someone. Yeah, setting agendas for conversations.
I also see a lot of talk about positive feedback. The compliment sandwich, there's fans and detractors, but I think that idea of just mixing in all the feedback so someone feels a little more safe. Yeah. One thing that I do, and I was always sort of proud of it, and I think I was a little misguided, is I do feedback, and I do it, like some people are saying, regularly. I try to, it's not like once a year, and I try to make my feedback so that there's no surprises, so that the person would, we've already talked about this, because it's just stuff comes up, but we talk. So there's no surprises during the feedback session. That's my goal. And then during the feedback session, I'd say, well, do you have any feedback for me? And I'd be so proud that I asked that. And then inevitably they'd have no feedback because I didn't give them time to think of all the ways I'm screwing up and making things harder for them. So in the future, I want to give people a chance to think about that and then kind of give heads up. I'm going to ask you that. Think about this a little bit. And partly it's to sort of set a tone of we get feedback. We get constructive feedback. That's what happens.
I think it's important to note that some people don't feel safe giving feedback when there's a power differential, right? And so acknowledging that as well, like owning to your employees, I am your boss, and it might be uncomfortable, but I do welcome that here. Some folks might not have experiences where that's welcomed.
I used to audition teachers a lot, and what we often talk about, every strength is also a weakness. And I found that a really good way to help people accept the feedback and say, oh, your strength is you're really, you got a lot of energy, you're really charming. And that also means that carries with it, you're not leaving room for people to talk in your classroom. So great ideas here. And let me pass it to you for a scenario that I think we know very well, COVID-19.
Yeah. So gosh, I'm seeing time, and we could just talk about this for hours. I saw somebody talking about the feedback sandwich, how that's not effective. Maybe we'll have some moments to talk about that later. But so as a lot of you have already referenced, we're sort of in a global trauma right now. I mean, this is such an intense time for so many individuals and organizations. And so we would be remiss not to mention that COVID-19 is inherently an opportunity for people to be pretty triggered. And so I think instead of just asking people to chat in, I'm just going to talk about this really quickly and briefly, which is to say that these circumstances, this global pandemic is really kind of the perfect recipe to create trauma for people, both organizationally and individually, because there is this inherent lack of safety. A lot of people are really genuinely authentically worried about their health without a lot of information about how to keep themselves safe. There's a sense of powerlessness. There's not much we can do. We get sort of, different information that contradicts itself all the time. And the sense of disregard, I think I saw somebody point to this before. Many people have different understandings or boundaries around what they feel or believe is safe related to COVID. And that can show up in the workplace where people are expected to work, or maybe some teams are expected to come in and have to, others don't have to. And so there can be this sort of disregard if you find that you're talking to individuals, employers about what you need around this pandemic, and their kind of beliefs or sort of regulations don't align with what it is that you feel keeps you safe. So for many, many reasons, this is kind of a recipe for stress for sure, and potentially trauma for many. And we know that there are things we can be doing to support people, right? And so I think one of the things that we would say is, if you organizationally don't do a lot of checking in with your employees, this is a time where you want to do that. You want to really be thinking about routines, clarity around expectations related to all the guidelines about COVID, really being clear in your communication with your employees about what they need and want, and sort of receiving their feedback, asking them how they feel about whatever procedures you've put in place, and eliciting probably anonymous feedback on a regular basis. I think it's important to just validate constantly that this is a struggle for everybody, and do frequent check-ins with folks, which I said already. I also think this is a time when self-care can be really, really challenging. People don't have access to the kinds of self-care routines that they used to have. And so figuring out how to support your employees, whether that's, making sure that they have a little more flexibility in their schedules, or making sure that the systems of support that they can access, that they do, if you have good EPA programs, things like that. So it's really important to be modeling and emphasizing self-care during this time.
I saw someone write in that there's this lack of clarity and sort of equity in their workspace around who gets to work from home and who doesn't. Imagine that's really complicated. something you're saying. So I can see we're out of time, and we're getting close to the end, and I know probably some of you are going to rush off to meetings. So I'm going to switch up the order of things a little bit for a second. So one is we're going to send you an email with a feedback link, and we really would love for you to fill that out. And my organization, we publish children's books that are illustrated as sort of a side project. So we'll raffle off one of these and mail you one, either in English or Spanish, if you fill out that survey, give us some feedback, we'll enter you into that raffle. And more importantly, we really appreciate your feedback. I'm sure in the work you do, you want to get feedback that is full of routine and clarity and all of that. Want to show you our contact information, which will also be in that email. But more importantly, from my end, I run an organization, Empowering Education. We work with schools, elementary, middle, love introductions to schools, to districts, to other people in this space. So if you're in that space, love to meet, or think that schools might want to work with us, I'd love some introductions. Emily is a jack of all trades, so
I'm so grateful you all were here today. Such great questions and comments that we weren't really able to dive into. I just feel like we need a part 2, maybe 2 more hours of a part 2. There's my email. I'm really happy to think and talk through these kinds of questions about your organization anytime. So I mean it when I say feel free to reach out. I'm happy to just be a thought partner with you around really sticky issues that are coming up related to trauma in your workplace.
Great. So we'll stick around for some Q&A if there's time, Randy, but I did want to ask one last question, which is, what is one thing you're going to want to remember from today, or go deeper in on your own? Because it's good, our brains can only handle so much. So what's the thing you want to keep? So go ahead and put it into that question box that we've been pushing you on, and we will send out a recording. We will send out our emails. Don't worry, the email that's coming out to you. So what is the thing you want to take away from this? Asking employees how they want to be managed too.
I see somebody said identifying your own triggers. Such an important one.
Yeah, there are serious stressors in people's lives, and it comes to work, of course.
Yeah, the childhood trauma pieces are really interesting. You're welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to share some resources. Routine, yeah, this is great.
And yes, my locus of control, some things I'm not able to I can't be responsible and should not be responsible. This is great. Well, I've so much enjoyed this time with you, and we will send out an email with that survey for some feedback, and we'll also have both of our contact info. So hopefully we get to continue the conversation with some of you. All right, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for your time. This was really informative for me as well, so I was furiously taking notes. And thanks to everyone that attended. I know that a lot of you are asking for the recording, so we'll get that out to you soon. And stay tuned for more webinars. Also check out our YouTube channel for some past ones. All right, to everyone, thanks a lot.